Welcome to Midweek Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. My name is Lahari Indraganti, and I'm a program fellow here at the Beacon Hill Friends House, which is a Quaker Center for Learning and Action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. Tonight, we have Dwight Dunston with the practice supporting participants to develop an integrity toolkit. Grief is a fundamental human experience. While there can be learning and growth in grief, getting there can be difficult. In this practice, Dwight will be sharing about being in integrity with one's grief and honoring the wisdom it brings. He will be sharing on his now completed year-long commitment to do a monthly grief ritual and the ways his practice of honoring his grief was shaped by his year-long experience. Dwight Dunston is a West Philly-based facilitator, hip-hop artist, educator, and activist who has brought his creativity, care, and compassion to schools, community centers, retirement homes, festivals, and stadiums all over the country and internationally. He's a 2006 graduate of Friends Central School in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, and has worked in Quaker institutions for most of his adult life, recently as part of the teaching team at Pendle Hill's 2022 spring term. Along with his bandmate Brian Jordan, Dwight was the friend in residence at Haverford College in 2019, and he has done workshops and concerts at Quaker schools and organizations all over, including Pennswood Village, Germantown Friends School, Morristown Friends, and Carolina Friends School. Dwight is a Level 2 certified Kingian nonviolence trainer, completing over 40 hours of training. He's also a trained mediator. You can hear Dwight in conversation with spirit-led artist and activist on Pendle Hill's new podcast, The Seed: Conversations for Radical Hope. Dwight, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Lahari, for that introduction, and it's so good to see you, friend. I feel like the last time we were together, we were in that room in Beacon Hill. I'm pretty sure that's the last time, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining midweek this week. I'm so grateful to Beacon Hill for having me and an opportunity to just share some learnings from, as was shared, a year-long commitment to do monthly grief rituals. So my hope is that the sharing of these practices, along with some conversation, supports folks here to deepen your relationship with your grief, and I very much see grief and gratitude as intertwined. So with your grief and the gratitude that lives within you, and I'm just honored to do some reflecting and sharing today. I am Dwight Dunston. I often like to bring in a few photos and just a little bit of context and framing of who I am. So these are some photos from important people in my ecosystem that have shaped me, shaped how I move in the world. That first photo, the top left, is my older sister. We grew up in different households. She grew up with her mother not too far away, and we really got to find each other and build close relationships in our adult life together. But I love this photo because it's a reminder of me that even as a little one, we were very closely connected. Next to that is a picture of my father, who has transitioned from this realm. And whenever I think about grief and gratitude, he is one of the people that comes to mind a lot for me. So I'm bringing him in here, and his love of people, which I certainly inherited from him. This bottom left picture is my younger sister and older brother, and my mother and my niece. Whenever I show up in spaces, my niece is at the core of my foundation in terms of how I think about how I move in the world. I'm like, there's a young person that's very much watching how I move. I got to be moving right, trying to move in integrity, bringing those folks into the space. And then these last two pictures are of some of my creative lives. As was shared, I've played music all over the place. Whoever will have me, I'm excited to play music. And it's very much a way that I make sense of the world, make sense of ideas in my head, make sense of conflicts within me, is to write about them and put them to song and support other people to use that also as a practice, as a tool for them, if that feels supportive. I'm calling into the space also, along with people, places. I have ancestors that in this country, in the US, were from Bellamy, Alabama, and Fayetteville, North Carolina, in Wilson, North Carolina, in Sumter, South Carolina. And then even before then, I also have ancestors that are from West Africa and parts of Europe, and bringing them all into the space with me today. Just the different places that have shaped me, whether in my lifetime or in previous lifetimes. All of that has got me to this moment. And I now call Philly my home, which I feel so blessed and grateful for. The practice that I want to introduce today happens about an hour from Philadelphia. Most of it happened about an hour from Philadelphia. This grief practice, once a month for the past year, I've traveled to Ventnor, New Jersey, which is, I got really comfortable with this trip. It's about an hour and 9 minutes or so from Philly. And it was the place that I frequented the most when I was home. I also did this practice in other parts of the country. With the one constant was I always did it at the ocean. And so I went down to Ventnor because it was one of the closest beaches for me. And I engaged in what began to take shape as sort of a 6-part practice that allowed me to really honor and what Francis Weller describes as become an apprentice to my grief, really to bring reverence to the feelings and emotions that I was having. Bring sacredness to those emotions, and to allow them to stir within me, to show me a path forward, to teach me things. I would say, just the synthesizing of all these different things I would do when I got to the beach. These 6 things kept showing up again and again. And those are opening prayer, song, worship, a reading, a question to nature, and then gratitudes and offering. And I'll go through each with a query attached to them. My hope is that we actually get to conversation with one another and maybe a little bit of practice here together. So upon arriving the ocean, to honor my grief, to bring integrity to the grief I was feeling, I would often start with an opening prayer. And I understand that folks might have different relationships to prayer. We'll call it something else, whatever that practice is, of bringing energy to a moment or to the space, to the place, whether out loud or in your heart. This, whatever prayer, however you define prayer, I invite you to see yourself into this portion of the practice. But often I would start with a silent prayer in my heart, asking either to be grounded in the space, sometimes I would ask around bringing a specific quality or characteristic to the moment. So to be softened, to be present, to be gracious to whatever comes up. Or I would also ask about or reflect and lift up a gratitude. I would open, or within prayer, this prayerful space, to share a gratitude that would really help me to be present and land at the ocean, really begin to lay out the time that I would have in this ritual space. And following the prayer, often I would invite in a song. Sometimes I would come to this grief practice with a song on my heart that I would want to sing. The last 3 times that I did this practice, I brought an instrument and just played some music for some time. But this practice of bringing a physical song, either it coming through me or playing music, and for those who don't consider themselves musical, it could be an opportunity to stretch or to hum or to create anything. But it really when I began to do this practice, it was uh, another pathway to really be present to the moment that I was preparing to be in, to allow when something that was connected to grief to wanted to present itself, to be as present as possible. I found song to be such a grounding force. Um, and so the question I have here of maybe there's a song that allows you to be present to the moment throughout the entirety, I would say, of the time together. I would say that I was in a worshipful space. But there would come points in the actual practice that I would settle into some silent worship. And in that silent worship, being here amongst friends or folks who are familiar with Quaker practices, some part of our time in worship is to listen inward and to get in touch with that inward light. And so in dropping down into worship, it actually allowed me to attune my heart and mind and soul into what I would say is my highest purpose, my holiest self, to get me closer to that. I really found that this practice, the practice of honoring my grief, was very much a pathway to thinking about the things that I value, or the reasons or intentions that I have made for myself in order to be in right relationship with my kin, with the earth, with a higher power. Worship often gets me there. It's like a super speed highway for me. Following worship, some intentional worship, I often, before even driving to the ocean, would pick a few books off my shelf that either were speaking to me or I just feel really called to reach for that day. And while at the beach, and in this practice, I would really hone in, and really how it happened, a number would pop into my head, and I would often open the book to that number, and it would be the exact thing I needed to read that day. But for other folks, it might be a text that you've come across or that has just been really rising to the top for you again and again, and that it feels significant or meaningful to bring with you to a grief ritual when you're looking to honor your grief. And so the question here is to think about a text that's speaking to you in this time. The second to last practice that I would often bring with me in this practice of honoring my grief, bringing integrity to my grief, is it often felt like when I really sat with my grief, there were questions that I was searching for an answer to, whether it was around a loss or a hardship, or a question of why something is happening, or what to do in a certain situation that was causing me distress, causing me grief. I would often ask a question on my heart, and the natural world that was very much around me was the ocean. In that practice, whenever I posed a question and I held it in my heart, I often, every time, actually, this was 100% true. Every time I got an answer that felt like the right answer. It wasn't always a easy answer to digest, but it was my practice to hold a question in my heart, and just to hold it both in nature and actually pose it to nature. And I love this idea that I've learned from Adrienne Marie Brown around in her book Emergent Strategy, around biomimicry. This idea that the natural world has so much to teach us about how to be human, or more than human can have ways to teach us how to be human. So I found this to be a beautiful practice in asking questions to the ocean, and receiving responses. And last, in this grief ritual time, to close the space, I would often share another round of gratitude. Sometimes the gratitudes that opened during that opening prayer found them their way back in my closing, the closing exchange, or new gratitudes would have risen to the top for me in that time. Case I wanted to honor them by sharing gratitudes, once again, either in my heart or out loud. And there were also a few times where I made offerings in this time, which were in the form of song. Sometimes I brought fruits or flowers, but when it felt right in the moment, I would often share offerings as well. So a question to close are, what are some things you want to offer the moment to show gratitude after this practice, and or maybe things you need to say in closing to show gratitude. For all 6 of these practices, I would say it felt like a very much, once again, a worshipful space. And most of the times where I walked through this grief practice, I would say the duration was about an hour at the ocean. So I would drive an hour, I would do these things for an hour, and then I would have an hour to drive back as well. And I know we don't have a full hour tonight to do those things, but my hope is that we can do a micro version of maybe some of these things in our time together. So that is the practice I wanted to bring tonight. Wondering if this is the time where maybe we do some practice, or there's some reflections or questions. One of the things that I learned this past year, and there's a few synonyms and ways that I have been called to describe that word integrity, both as it shows up in Quaker practice, and before I became a Quaker, it showed up in other places. But to me, and there's one piece about integrity is has to do with honesty, and so being truthful with oneself, being truthful with an aspect of some part of your life, or being truthful with in practice in relationship with others, or things that are outside of you. I have just been called in my life in this time, in this season, to really excavate or bring some light to the ways that grief has shown up in my life, and the ways that when I'm in right relationship with my grief, when I honor my grief, when I'm honest about my grief, the wisdoms and learnings and transformation that have happened, are times when I'm dishonest about the impact of grief, or how it's guiding my life, has actually caused pain or hurt, or caused disconnection from myself, from what I feel called to be in this time, or from others, from relationship. This idea of integrity, I think there's this practice of integrity that very much feels like a self journey, even though it's being shaped by our relationships and the communities that we're a part of. I think many of us are called to be in integrity and right relationship with the things we espouse, that we're committed to, the values we espouse, we're committed to, the ways we might feel like we're called to be in the world, the vocations we're called to be stepping into. When I think about grief, I think we're very much socialized to be to be very disconnected from this thing that we all go through. I think there's subcultures within our broader culture that are very gifted and skilled at navigating and integrating the lessons from grief. But I think culturally we're socialized out of being apprentice to our grief. So when I think about integrity and being in integrity with our grief, I'm very much thinking about how can we be honest about the pains of our hearts, the pains of the heart on the hearts of the people around us, and in actually bringing some attention to our own relationship with grief. Do some I think it actually is a pathway to us transforming uh, and being, yeah, more or less being closer to the inner light, what I think the inner light is actually calling us to be, which is to be love. So one of the things. I'm curious if there's no more questions, I would love to maybe um try this practice. Maybe it's a micro version of it, but does that sound okay for folks? Great. So I won't share screen again, but I'm gonna drop some things into the chat. Um, and to start, as we center in on this, and once again, when I would do this practice, so much of it felt like a worshipful space to be in, and we started with some worship tonight. So, continuing in that spirit, um, we'll just take a moment to um, do some internal centering um, in silence. And in that time, an invitation to think about a quality or characteristic that you might want to call in that will support you in honoring your grief, and or a gratitude that you have on your heart as you settle into this practice. And as we transition out of that moment, I'm curious if anybody noticed any qualities or characteristics that came up for you, or any gratitudes that just immediately sort of landed on your heart.